It was November 19, 1775. The Revolutionary War had broken out 7 months prior. The Congress, now seeing the war on the brink of its horizon, recognized the need for outsider help, and thus formed the Secret Committee of Correspondence. To quote from a CIA document, resolved that a committee of 5 would be appointed for the sole purpose of corresponding with our friends in Great Britain and other parts of the world, and that they lay their correspondence before Congress when directed. Resolved that this Congress will make provision to defray all such expenses as they may arise by carrying on such correspondence, and for the payment of such agents as the said committee may send on this service. The committee would later play a big role in helping the Americans win the revolution. Before we go there, however, let's first take a look at today's topic. Today's topic is diplomacy and debate, things that impacted the American Revolution, researched and made into a documentary by Perrin, Ince, and Natty. Prior to the Revolutionary War, all of the colonies' diplomatic relationships would be covered by representatives stationed in London. Because of this, the colonies did not have foreign offices nor treaties with other governments. According to Elmer Pilschke, an author who wrote the book called U.S. Department of State, A Reference History, the colonies later established intercolonial agencies and created a rudimentary form of a committee of correspondence. In 1775, the Congress formed an official committee of correspondence, or as it was called at the time, the Secret Committee of Correspondence. This Secret Committee of Correspondence later became the Department of State. No nation has friends, only interests. A quote from Charles de Gaulle. According to ushistory.gov, France was looking for revenge against Great Britain after their defeat in the 7 Years' War. Upon hearing about the colonies rebelling, they saw an opportunity. To decide whether or not to send support for the rebels, they needed more information. So Vergennes, the foreign minister of France at that time, sent Julien Alexandre Achard de Bonlevier on a mission to make contact with the Secret Committee of Correspondence. After a few meetings with the committee, Bonlevier filed an exaggerated report back to France. Here's an example of what he wrote. Everyone here is a soldier. The troops are well clothed, well paid, and well armed. They have more than 50,000 regular soldiers and an even larger number of volunteers who do not wish to be paid. Judge how men of this caliber will fight. They are more powerful than we could have thought, beyond imagination powerful. You will be astonished by it. Nothing shocks or frightens them. You can count on that. Independency is a certainty for 1776. There will be no drawing back. Sources, however, contradict this. ushistory.gov says that during that time, Washington's army was only about 18,000 in strength. Boston Tea Party ships and museums also stated that the number of the Continental Army never exceeded 48,000 at any one time during the Revolution. Similar styles of exaggeration were found in his texts. This exaggeration, however, would prove to be beneficial to the colonists. Exaggeration was also a common theme in diplomacy. According to ushistory.gov, Bonlevier's report proved to be very persuasive, and Vergennes wrote the following to his agent in London. We will give you, secretly, 1 million. We will endeavor to persuade the court of Spain to unite in giving you another. With these 2 millions, you shall found a great commercial establishment, and at your own risk and peril, you shall furnish to America arms and everything else necessary to sustain war. Our arsenals will deliver to you arms and munitions, but you shall pay for them. You will not demand money of the Americans, for they have none, but you can ask return in their staple products. However, the story doesn't end there. It gets more interesting after the Battle of Saratoga.
Now, moving on to the Battle of Saratoga. To be clear, there was no one battle known as Saratoga, but rather 2 different battles known as Battle of Freeman's Farm and the Battle of Bemis Height. British side was led mainly by General John Burgoyne, who was abandoned by his other 2 armies, while the Americans were headed by General Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. During the First Battle of Freeman's Farm on September 19, 1777, the opposing troops met on the abandoned property of Loyalist John Freeman near Saratoga New York. The intense battle lasted many hours. Momentum shifted numerous times, but neither side made significant gains until Burgoyne ordered his column of German troops to assist the weak British position, forcing the Americans to retreat. Despite this, the British suffered twice as many deaths as Americans and were unable to continue their journey to Albany. The second attack was the Battle of Bemis Heights. Burgoyne chose to wait for reinforcement from New York City. Meanwhile, the number of American forces under Gates' command grew to almost 13,000 and continued to expand. Burgoyne knew that waiting for support was pointless by October 7, 1777, when supplies were rapidly running out in the forested region of Bemis Heights, south of Saratoga. Burgoyne sent a spy group to threaten the Americans. However, the Americans became aware of the movement and forced the British to retreat. Burgoyne chose to lead his troops north to safety, but severe rain and bitter cold delayed their progress. Gates' forces surrounded what remained of Burgoyne's army within 2 days. This event marked the turning point of the American Revolution, in which the British surrendered for the first time. The Battle of Saratoga was a significant battle in the American Revolutionary War because it boosted the American spirit and convinced the French, Spanish, and Dutch to support them in their fight against a mutual enemy. Next, I will be explaining about the Americans' relation with Spain during the American Revolution. When the American Revolution began in 1775, Spain saw a chance to reclaim lost territories from the British. King Carlos III was the king at the time. By May 1776, France created a secret corporation to help the Americans rebel. King Carlos decided that he would not enter any war until Spain was in the best position to defend its land. The Count of Floridablanca then came up with a plan. He believed that he could achieve this goal through diplomacy rather than war. So he made every effort to put pressure on the British by secretly funding and supplying the Americans, as well as threatening to enter the war to turn the tide against Britain. King Carlos III issued a royal order to the governors of Louisiana and Cuba in December, instructing them to open Spanish ports in the New World to American trade boats. This plan raised American about 500,000 pesos.
In the American Revolution, there have been quite a few debates, but today I will be talking about a few major ones. So the first example of debate in the American Revolution was a debate that was held entirely through newspapers. This began right after the Stamp Act riots in North America began. So the Stamp Act riot is basically an act that forces the colonies to pay taxes and that legal documents must have a tax stamp on it. This is where the name comes from. So in the London newspaper, the writer wrote about how the colonists had no right to protest against the taxes and soon began insulting them and talking about how weak and fragile they were. This article was then republished in newspapers in Massachusetts and New York. However, the editor for the New York papers was probably offended by what the London writer wrote and decided to add his own little opinions about what the London writer wrote. So he did this by adding little notes in italics after the statements. An example of this is when the London writer wrote, "As for New York, they are too honest and industrious a people to encourage insurrections." And the New York editor wrote after this in italics, "Thank you, mister, for this," in a very sarcastic tone. Another debate that happened during the American Revolution was the debate about what happened on the night of the Boston Massacre. So on the night of the massacre, locals of the town were heckling the soldiers that were guarding the house of the tax collectors. So we believe that the reason they were heckling is because the British government had painted the locals of Boston as unruly and aggressive, to the point that the tax collectors needed protection from them. Well, in the midst of this altercation, someone yelled "fire." The circumstances or context of this person yelling "fire" is unknown. However, at the end, 5 people were killed. So this began the debate of who was to blame for the deaths of the people? Was it the military people just ready to shoot, or were the military shooting for self-defense? So both sides stated their argument in pamphlets, either pro-military or anti-military. But at the end, the debate seemed to have no winner. This was when John Adams had to come in. He came in and he had a bit of a dilemma. He needed to support the military, but also not make the Bostonians look as bad as the government had painted them. So at the end, his conclusion was that the soldiers shot in self-defense because they were attacked. However, he said that the people who attacked the soldiers were foreigners and mixed race and not pure Bostonians. And this worked out really well. He was able to support the soldiers and they were acquitted for their crimes. And the Bostonians were also not mad at him because he did not say that the Bostonians were the people to blame, since he said that the people who attacked the soldiers were foreigners and from other places.